All right, so we are going to be talking about cells now. We are going to start out by talking about kind of general components of a cell, different types of cells, different kind of categories of cells, and then we're really going to spend most of our time focusing in on eukaryotic cells. Those are plant cells slightly, but then mostly animal cells, and we're going to talk about all the different parts of the animal cells and then how animal cells are going to be interacting with their environment. So first let's start with what is a cell? And we're going to talk about the main components. So whether or not we're talking about a bacteria cell, for example, which is a single-celled organism, or if we're talking about an animal cell, or an animal, which is multicellular, many cells, or multicellular organism. Either way, we're going to talk about some main components. So let's talk about those four main components. And then we're going to get into some more details about eukaryotic cells specifically. So the first of the main components is called the plasma membrane. Now, the plasma membrane is basically the outside of the cell. It's what's going to enclose the cell, and it's what keeps it separate from its environment. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about the plasma membrane, but as a general idea here, the main component, we're just going to write out that it encloses the cell and separates it from the environment. All right, so that's basically the barrier between the cell, the stuff that's in the cell, and then the exterior is the plasma membrane. The second main component of all cells, whether it's a single-celled organism like bacteria or a multicellular organism like an animal and all their individual cells, is the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is basically this kind of liquidy gel-type stuff that's in the inside of the cell. This is the area that contains all the different proteins in it and other different molecules that are dissolved in it, gases are dissolved in it, and these are all of the different kind of nutrients and things that are needed in the cell. It's part of what allows the cell to function. So liquid or gel containing the proteins we said, so containing things like proteins and other molecules that are needed for cellular function. And this is also where we see all of our other organelles kind of floating in this cytoplasm, and we're going to get into some details about those specific organelles. And they're hanging out in this area that contains the cytoplasm. The third of the main components is DNA. So DNA is our genetic material. And so we get this from our parents, the genetic material from parent or parents, depending on what we're talking about. So if we're talking about a single-celled organism or an organism that's able to asexually reproduce, then we'd be talking about a single parent. If we're talking about multicellular organism and a type of species or an organism that is sexually reproducing, then we would be talking about two parents. So the genetic material that we get from the parent or parents, and this, so that holds the instructions for, let's see, we'll just say holds the instructions, oops, for all the proteins. All right, and we talked about this in our biological molecules area. So we talked about DNA and how it codes for all of the proteins in the cell. And the last of our main components for our ribosomes. So again, whether or not we're talking about a bacteria, whether or not we're talking about a multicellular organism like an animal or an animal cell, all of these types of cells have ribosomes. And the ribosomes are the actual cell parts, the kind of machinery that are needed to make proteins. So these are the four main components of these types of cells, or of all of these cells, is that we have this plasma membrane, something that separates things from the environment. It separates the cell from the environment. Now, other cells, like some bacteria cells, or all bacteria cells, will have a cell wall as well. Plant cells also have a cell wall. Fungi have a cell wall, but they also have plasma membranes. So all of these different types of cells have plasma membranes. All of these different cells have cytoplasm, so they have this liquidy gel that contains all of the stuff that's needed, different molecules and things. They all have DNA, so this nucleic information they're able to pass on from generation to generation. And then all of them have ribosomes, and that's because we need to make proteins, and the ribosomes are the machinery that make proteins. So now that we've talked about kind of some of the main components that all cells share, let's talk about the size of cells. So we talked about kind of the main components. Let's talk about the size and then the differences in the cells. So cells are pretty small in general. So there are some larger cells, like an individual cell. One single cell is an egg. So an egg is a single cell. So if you think of a chicken egg, that's a pretty large cell. That's a really, really large cell. But most cells, when we're talking about them, are quite small, and we see them under a microscope only. If we can see them under even a regular microscope you would find in a classroom, sometimes they're so small you wouldn't find them until you're using a much higher powered microscope. So cells are very, very small. They vary in size, but they can be about 1 to 100 micrometers in size, so quite small. So cells are small. Why are they small? They're small because the nutrients and the waste have to get from the surface to all of the parts of the cell. So our nutrients and wastes have to get from the surface to all parts of the cell. So really when we're talking about nutrients, right, we're talking about a cell, and we want to be able to get the nutrients. So here's our cell, let's say, and we get our nutrients. Let's say we've got glucose coming along, and we want to get glucose inside the cell so that we can make some energy from that glucose. Now, if the glucose is going in right here, we want to be able to get the glucose, say, inside of the cell somewhere along here. Now, if we have a really big cell, and the glucose is going in here, and it's this little tiny dot of glucose, it's going to take quite some time for it to get to, let's say, the middle-ish area where it would need to get to be processed. Versus if a cell is small, it has a lot less of a distance to go. And then also, if we have something over here that's making waste, the time it's going to take to get to the edge of the cell in order to get the waste out is going to be less than the time it would take for a larger cell to then get the waste out of the cell. So it's important to have a cell be an appropriate size so that we can have this exchange of nutrients getting into the cell and being able to get the nutrients all over the cell where we need to get them, and then also taking the waste from all over the cell and getting it out of the cell because we want to get rid of it as soon as possible. So the small size is going to keep all areas of the cell near the surface. So keeps all areas of the cell near the surface. And also, what we can say about this is that cells actually have a large surface area to volume ratio. So cells have a large surface area to volume ratio. And what that means is this. Let's go ahead and get rid of this illustration here. And if we take a look at a cell, let's say this is kind of our large cell, which is really big. And if we're trying to get a nutrient here, let's talk about maybe like sodium or something really tiny. So sodium getting into the cell, and we want to get sodium maybe over here for whatever reason. But this is where it's coming in because this is the digestive tract over here, and so we're absorbing our sodium into the cell here, and we want to get it up here for whatever chemical we're making, whatever molecule we're making. So if we have a cell that is very large, it could take quite some time for the sodium to get over there. But when we look at it, if we're talking about our surface area, we're talking about the area, right, or the distance here, of the surface of the cell. So we have this entire distance is the surface of the cell here. And then we have the volume, which of course is the amount of the space in the inside here. But if we took something that has the same area here, right, the same volume, and let's say we split it up, okay, we split it up into, let's say, 4 cells. Of course, these will be a little bit larger. I'm leaving some space so we can see. What we then are doing is we have the same type of volume here, if we were to add up the volume of each of these kind of squares or these cells, but we have a much larger surface area. So if we take the surface area, if we measured, let's say we took a tape measure, and we measured all the way around this cell, and all the way around the next cell, and all the way around this cell, and all the way around this cell, what we would find there would be a higher amount of surface area here. But we would have the same volume. And so in this case, we have much greater surface area, and that's actually going to be more beneficial to cells because then we can get a lot more stuff in here if we have more surface area, if we have more plasma membrane, more ways to get into the cell, and of course then we have a smaller distance to get where we want to go. So then if you can imagine if we went even further and we had the same kind of area here and we had lots and lots and lots of tiny cells in here, if we added up all of the plasma membranes here, that would be a much, much larger surface area, which is great because then when we get all these little tiny things like sodium into the cell, we can then have lots of area in order to do that, lots of space for exchange with the environment. And that's one of the things that makes cells so important and why they're so small, is so that we can get all of these things in and out pretty easily, high amount of surface area, and then we still have the same amount of volume. So rather than having one gigantic cell that makes it really difficult, has a smaller surface area to get things in and out, and has to cross large distances, we have many, 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 many smaller ones that have larger surface area, and then it doesn't have to cross that much distance. So not only are cells pretty small, we also have many different types of cells. Again, they vary in size, and that depends on the type of cell. But we also have different shapes of cells. So some cells are going to be columnar. We have a nucleus in here, and it's a column-shaped cell. Some cells are going to be cuboidal, cube-shaped cell. Some cells are nice and flat and round cells. And these are all some examples here of animal cells, for example. In plant cells have cell walls. They're oftentimes kind of rectangular. So they have a cell wall, which I'm drawing right now on the outside, that's connecting it to the other cells. And then this kind of wall on the inside that I was drawing was the plasma membrane. And then they have their nucleus. So this would be a plant cell, for example. And then we have the bacteria cell, which would be smaller than any of these cells. In the bacteria cell, we have a plasma membrane as well as a cell wall. We don't have a nucleus. We have a nucleoid region that has the DNA and we have some other organelles in here. Oftentimes, we'll see a flagella, which is kind of a tail that allows it to move. So we have different types of cells, so different shapes. Write this down. So they vary in size. They vary in shape. We can see different shapes of cells here. So these types of cells here, like the animal cells, would serve different functions. So they have different functions. A nice flat cell like this one here, flat, thin, round cell, it's going to have an easier time getting things across this type of cell. So we see this in areas like in the lungs where we want to have oxygen move across the cell very easily and carbon dioxide move across the cell very easily. Something like this columnar cell, we might see some microvilli on top of it. This would be like in the digestive system. A nice long cell where we can get things in here and it's going to get into the cell and be absorbed. So different functions for the different shapes. And then the different things that they carry out. They also have different components. So we already mentioned the 4 similar components, but we already mentioned also here, like a plant has a cell wall, whereas animal cells have no cell walls. Bacteria also have cell walls. So also cells are very dynamic, meaning that they're active. They're very active. They have lots of cell processes that are happening. They can move. Many of them can move. So a bacteria clearly can move. It has this tail on there that allows it to move around. We also have cells in our body that are able to move around. Immune system cells, our white blood cells, kind of move throughout our body. Not even just in the bloodstream, but actually kind of crawl through all of our tissues looking for bacteria and things like that. As well as the sperm cell. So a sperm cell is similar to bacteria in that it has a flagella. Not all bacteria have flagella, by the way. So they can move, they change. So they can change their function sometimes. They can change what's filling them and what they're composed of. So for example, in the skin, cells that are kind of deeper inside of our body have a lot less keratin. Keratin is a hard protein, but as our skin cell moves more to the surface, then it gets more and more and more filled with keratin, for example, making a nice rough barrier on the outside. And then they carry out the functions of life. So, functions of life. So there are a lot of aspects of cells, a lot of things that can make cells different. All right, so let's take a look at kind of some of these types of cells. I've already mentioned bacteria cells and animal cells, plant cells. So let's take a look at our phylogenetic tree of life. So our tree of life looks something like this. We have a common ancestor in the bottom here, and then we have a branch out here. We have a branch out here, and then we have a branch coming off of here. Now, when we're actually looking at a tree of life, I'm just going to draw kind of parts of it. We'll have different things coming off of here, different things coming off of here. When we get up here, we've got different things coming off of here, and here. Over here, we've got lots of branches coming off of here. So this is not exact. This is just my rough drawing here. But basically what we're talking about is we're branching it out, and we're separating it into the 3 domains. So we have 3 domains of life. This branch over here is bacteria. So bacteria is one domain of life. This branch right here is archaea. And then this branch over here is eukaryota, or eukaryota. Oops. So these are our 3 domains of life. Now, eukaryota over here has us, Animalia. So we are in the eukaryotic domain. Archaea and bacteria we'll talk about a little bit more before we move into our eukaryotic branch. So let's talk about bacteria and archaea first. So bacteria and archaea are both unicellular organisms. So unicellular. Uni meaning one, so single-celled organisms. They both are prokaryotic. Prokaryotic is a type of cell. It's a cell that does not have a nucleus. Which means it doesn't have a nucleus that houses its DNA. And we kind of already mentioned that when we drew the bacteria cell, we said that it does not have a nucleus, but it has a nucleoid region. So rather than having a kind of closed-off section called the nucleus that contains the DNA, instead bacteria and archaea just have an area where the DNA hangs out, but it's not protected by an additional membrane. So they have no nucleus, they have no membrane-bound organelles. we're going to talk a lot more about our membrane-bound organelles that we find in our eukaryotic cells. And then also one of the things that we mentioned already is the cell wall. So we find a cell wall in both bacteria and archaea, and that's something that we don't find in our eukaryotic cells or our animal cells. Now, kind of generally, the difference between bacteria and archaea is that archaea are actually very, very similar to bacteria in both size and shape. So size and shape are similar. But their genes, their genetic information is more similar to eukaryotic cells or animal cells than they are to bacteria cells. So they're kind of their own domain. They have their own thing going on there. So their genetic information is similar to eukaryotic cells. So that's kind of the general overview that we're going to talk about bacteria and archaea. We're going to focus most of our energy into the third domain, which is eukaryota. So our three domains again are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota, or eukarya. So in eukarya, we can have both unicellular and multicellular organisms. So again, unicellular, single-celled organisms, which we'll see in the group called Protists. We have different types of ciliates and protists and things that all are single-celled organisms, amoebas, things like that. And then multicellular, meaning many cells, and those would be something like plant cells or plants or animals that have multi-cells. We do have membrane-bound organelles. We also have a nucleus. So we already mentioned there's a nucleus that protects the DNA, houses the DNA. It's an additional membrane that holds onto and protects the DNA. And then we can talk about the different types of groups within eukarya or eukaryota. So one group that we've already talked about are the plants, or briefly mentioned rather, are the plants. This is actually plantae. And so these would be, things obviously like trees and grass, and other plants, conifers, mosses, ferns, even something like green algae is a plant. So plants are different in that they have the ability to photosynthesize. What that means is they're able to take sun energy or light energy and turn it into something like glucose or other molecules. They do this in organelles called chloroplasts. So their chloroplasts are actually these kind of they're made up of something called thylakoids, which are little discs, little green discs that are within a larger kind of disc. And within these little green discs is where they actually go through the process of photosynthesis, where they take in sunlight energy, and then they can convert that into chemical compounds. So I should probably write that here instead, chemical compounds. A lot of the time what they're making, though, is glucose. And then they also have cell walls. So just like we mentioned previously, they have cell walls, and eukaryotic or animal cells do not have cell walls. Their cell walls are made of cellulose, which we talked about in a previous section in the biological molecules. So we have our long chains of glucose, and these long chains of glucose are going to make up those cell walls in the plant cell. The next kingdom within eukarya that we're going to talk about briefly is fungi. So fungi are things like mushrooms, mold, different molds and yeasts. These do not go through photosynthesis, so they seem kind of plant-like. If we think of mushrooms or yeast or molds, they seem kind of plant-like, but they are not like plants in that they do not photosynthesize. They also have a cell wall, and their cell wall is made up of chitin. And we talked about that in the biological molecules as well. So chitin is kind of the cell wall for fungi, which are not plants. We also saw chitin in our insects as the exoskeleton. All right. So the next group of eukarya that I'd like to talk about briefly are the protists. So the protists are kind of a catch-all group. They're a catch-all group of both unicellular organisms or colonial organisms, meaning those that kind of live in a group that are necessary to work together. Now, the protists, I'm not getting to the animals yet, but the animals are another kingdom. But when we're talking about the different kingdoms of eukarya, we would be talking about plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Protists, as was already mentioned, is kind of this catch-all group. We kind of throw lots of things in this protist group because we're not sure where they fit. They kind of fit in plants for some things. They kind of fit in fungi for some things. They kind of fit in bacteria for some things. They kind of fit in animalia for some things. And so we kind of stick them in the protist group first. So things like paramecium is in the protist group. Other things like amoebas. Some algae are in the protist group. Some other things like euglena, colonial, or volvox, if you've heard that, or stentor. So these are different types of organisms that we would find in the protist group. So some are similar to plants. Some are similar to animals. Some are similar to bacteria. So then the last group of eukarya that I would like to talk about is animalia, or animals. And that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about this semester, are animals, and then briefly plants as well throughout the semester. So our animalia, the kingdom animalia, can include, of course, animals like humans, and other animals that we can think of, like other mammals, let's say, like tigers, bears, etc. Big things. But that also includes things like birds, fish, reptiles, insects, and even things like worms and sponges. So our animals, oftentimes we kind of think of animals like our cats and dogs, but remember that humans are animals, remember that birds and fish, and even things like reptiles and insects and worms and sponges are fish, or are not fish, are animalia. Animalia, this group is multicellular. So no longer are we talking about unicellular organisms, we're talking about organisms that are made up of many cells. They do not photosynthesize. They do not have a cell wall, so no cell wall on eukaryotic cells or animal cells. And they can be motile. So some cells in the body are motile. We already mentioned in human bodies as well as other animal bodies, they can have immune system cells that are walking around in the body, basically checking out the areas, making sure everything stays safe. So now that we've talked a bit about the different types of cells here, we've started kind of more general. We've talked about what a cell is, the main components of a cell. We talked about their size and why their size is the way it is, the different shapes and components. We talked about the phylogenetic tree of life, so you should know the 3 domains. You should know a little bit about the bacteria archaea that we mentioned. and then eukaryota. And we've divided up into these kingdoms: the plant, the fungi, the protist, and the animals. And now what we're going to do is we are going to move on to the different types of organelles that we're going to see in eukaryotic cells specifically.